The wind moves through Atlantic City at 5 in the morning, and it carries nothing. No music, no laughter, no clatter of chips hitting felt. Just the hollow moan of air threading through the gaps in boarded storefronts, past the rusted skeleton of a rolling chair abandoned on the boardwalk, over the body of a man sleeping beneath the wooden planks where 100 million feet once walked. The casinos still stand. They rise from the fog like tombstones made of glass, their names flickering in half-dead neon. One sign reads only, "ULAZA now." The other letters burned out years ago and nobody bothered to fix them. Why would they? The building is empty. Has been empty. Will stay empty until someone decides whether to implode it or let the Atlantic Ocean do the job instead. 1 block from the boardwalk, the poverty begins. It does not creep. It announces itself. Cash for gold shops, plywood windows, a check cashing place next to a liquor store next to a storefront church. The median household income here is $35,000 a year. The state average is $90,000. 1 in 3 residents lives below the poverty line. They have lived below it for 40 years. They will live below it tomorrow. This is Atlantic City, America's original casino town. The place that was supposed to prove gambling could save a dying place. The laboratory where an entire state rolled the dice on desperation and watched the snake eyes come up again and again and again. The numbers are staggering. In 2014 alone, 4 casinos closed. 8,000 people lost their jobs in a city of 40,000. The unemployment rate hit 14%, double the state average, and the foreclosure rate became the highest in the nation. Property values collapsed from $20 billion to $11 billion in 4 years. The city approached bankruptcy. It did not approach it gently. But here is what makes Atlantic City different from every other American ruin. This was not a company town abandoned when the factory moved overseas. This was not a boom town that dried up when the gold ran out. This was a planned resurrection. A voter-approved miracle. In 1976, the people of New Jersey were told that casinos would save Atlantic City. They were told the money would flow down into schools and hospitals and neighborhoods. They were told a rising tide would lift all boats. 50 years later, the tide is still rising. Sea levels threaten to flood a barrier island where 87% of residents already live in a 100-year floodplain. The casinos still take in billions. The residents still live in poverty. Atlantic City is the story of America's original sin, the belief that you can gamble your way out of ruin, the faith that luck is a development strategy. Twice this barrier island promised salvation. First as a seaside utopia for the working class, then as a casino-fueled phoenix rising from the ashes. Both times, reality collected its debts. This is how it happened. This is how a sandbar became a dream, became a monument, became a mausoleum. Absecon Island was never meant to support a city. The land itself rejected the very idea. For 10,000 years, the Lenni Lenape people came here, but only seasonally, only temporarily, only to harvest what the sea offered before retreating to solid ground. They understood something that the men who came later refused to accept. This place was not meant for permanence. The island stretched 5 miles long and a 1/4 mile wide at its broadest point. Marsh grass and mosquitoes dominated the interior. Sand dominated everything else. The sand was relentless. It moved when the wind moved. It buried what it touched. It infiltrated every structure foolish enough to rise against it. In 1850, exactly 7 permanent dwellings stood on Absecon Island. Most belonged to the descendants of Jeremiah Leeds, a family of fishermen and farmers who had made an uneasy peace with the landscape. 5 miles of impassable marshland separated them from the mainland. The only path was an old indigenous trail that would one day become Florida Avenue. Getting to this sandbar required either a boat or a death wish. No one looked at this place and saw a city. No one except Jonathan Pitney. Dr. Pitney practiced medicine on the mainland, in the village of Absecon. He was not a young man given to flights of fancy. He was a physician, trained in observation, devoted to evidence. But somewhere in his careful mind, a vision had taken root that defied everything the evidence suggested. Pitney believed in the healing power of sea air. This was not quackery by the standards of his time. In the mid-19th century, physicians across Europe and America prescribed ocean breezes for everything from tuberculosis to nervous exhaustion. The Industrial Revolution had packed millions of workers into coal-choked cities where the air tasted of sulfur and the water ran brown. The sea represented purity, escape, the chance to breathe something that was not trying to kill you. Pitney looked at the desolate sandbar 5 miles from his office and saw not what it was, but what it could become: a health resort, a sanctuary for the industrial masses of Philadelphia who lived just 60 miles away, but might as well have been on the moon for all the access they had to clean air and open water. He saw trains bringing thousands of pale, coughing factory workers to the shore, where the salt breeze would restore them before sending them back to the machines. It was an impossible vision, and he pursued it anyway. In 1852, Pitney found his partner. Richard Osborne was a civil engineer from Philadelphia, a man who understood that dreams required infrastructure. Together, they conceived the Camden Atlantic Railroad, a line that would cut through the marshes and pine barrens to connect the industrial heart of Pennsylvania to the empty shore of New Jersey. The construction defied reason. Workers laid track through swamps that swallowed equipment whole. Mosquito clouds so thick they darkened the sun forced crews to burn sulfur just to keep working. The soft ground required endless reinforcement. The project hemorrhaged money. But on July 5, 1854, the impossible happened. A locomotive pulled into Absecon Island carrying the first passengers, who had endured a grueling 2.5-hour journey through some of the most inhospitable terrain on the eastern seaboard. They stepped off the train onto sand. Nothing but sand. A few ramshackle buildings. The crash of waves. The smell of salt. Atlantic City was incorporated that same year. Population, 250 souls, most of whom had no idea their sandbar had just been declared a city. The name itself was Osborne's invention. He had sketched out a grid of streets, naming them after the oceans and the states, an act of pure imagination imposed on a landscape that contained almost nothing. Pacific Avenue, Atlantic Avenue, Mediterranean Avenue. These names would become famous, but not for the reasons Osborne intended. They would become famous because in 1935, the Parker brothers would print them on a board game called Monopoly, turning Atlantic City's streets into symbols of American aspiration, from the slums of Mediterranean to the riches of Boardwalk. But in 1854, there was no boardwalk. There was only sand. And the sand was a problem that nearly killed the city before it could begin. The tourists came slowly at first, a few hundred in the first years, then a few thousand, drawn by advertisements promising the healthful sea air Dr. Pitney had championed. They arrived on the rattling train, stepped onto the beach, and immediately understood why the Lenni Lenape had never stayed. The sand invaded everything. It blew into the grand hotels that ambitious developers had begun constructing along the shore. It coated the fine clothes of Philadelphia socialites. It ground into the gears of watches and the bearings of carriages. It infiltrated food and drink and bedding. Guests would wake in the morning to find their pillows gritty, their teeth crunching on particles that had drifted through closed windows while they slept. The wealthy tourists Pitney had dreamed of attracting were repelled. Why travel 60 miles to sleep in a sandbox when Newport and Cape May offered refinement? The city's investors panicked. They had staked fortunes on the promise of seaside luxury, and the very element that made their location unique was driving customers away. Then, in 1870, a railroad conductor named Alexander Boardman and a hotel owner named Jacob Keem proposed a solution so simple it bordered on genius. A wooden walkway, 8 feet wide, running from the beach into town. The idea was practical, not grand. Keep the sand off guests' shoes and out of train cars. Nothing more. The cost was $5,000, half the town's annual tax revenue, a significant gamble for an unproven concept. The first boardwalk was a humble thing. Wooden planks laid across the sand, dismantled each winter to prevent storm damage, reassembled each spring. It was not meant to be permanent. But something unexpected happened. The boardwalk became more than a solution to the sand problem. It became the attraction itself. People strolled. They had never really strolled before, not like this. The boardwalk created a linear public space unlike anything else in America, a democratic promenade where factory workers and financiers walked the same planks, breathed the same air, watched the same waves. The rigid class hierarchies of the Gilded Age softened slightly at the shore. The city understood immediately what it had created. In 1880, the boardwalk was rebuilt wider, sturdier, permanent. The city formally reopened with fanfare and fireworks. The message was clear. Atlantic City was no longer a sandy outpost, it was a destination. Then, in 1889, nature reminded everyone who was actually in charge. A hurricane struck the barrier island with winds that peeled roofs like paper. Storm surge pushed the ocean over the land until the city sat under 6 feet of water. The boardwalk was obliterated, not damaged, not weakened, gone. Lesser cities would have surrendered. Atlantic City rebuilt. This time, the boardwalk rose on pilings, elevated above the beach, wider and stronger than before. The city had learned a lesson it would forget again and again. Nature destroys, but ambition rebuilds. By 1900, the population had exploded from 250 to 27,000. The transformation defied everything that should have happened on a 5-mile sandbar surrounded by marsh. The boardwalk became a cathedral. Steel Pier opened in 1898, jutting 1,000 feet into the Atlantic. Visitors paid admission to see vaudeville, acts, big bands, and the spectacle that would make the pier famous. Diving horses, animals trained to leap from a 40-foot platform into a pool below, a feat of absurdist entertainment that drew crowds for decades. The rolling chairs appeared in 1876, wicker thrones pushed along the boardwalk by attendants, most of them black men who had migrated from the South. The chairs became status symbols. To be seen in a rolling chair, reclining like royalty, while a uniformed worker provided locomotion, announced to the world that you had arrived, that you could afford leisure, that the sand and sun existed to serve you. The Miss America pageant launched in 1921, not from any noble impulse toward female achievement, but from pure commercial desperation. Hotel owners realized that summer ended at Labor Day, and so did tourist dollars. They needed something to extend the season. They created a beauty contest, paraded young women on the boardwalk, and manufactured a tradition that would outlast almost everything else the city built. At its peak, Atlantic City boasted more than 1,200 hotels and boarding houses. The great palaces rose along the boardwalk like monuments to the age. The Tremor, the Marlborough Blenheim, the Shelburne, the Claridge. The Claridge opened in 1930, 24 stories of brick and limestone, the tallest building on the shore, a skyscraper by the sea. The city had willed itself into existence. A doctor's impossible vision had become a metropolis of pleasure. The sand had been conquered. The ocean had been tamed. The tourists had been delivered by the millions. And then Prohibition arrived, and Atlantic City decided to become something else entirely. On January 17, 1920, the 18th Amendment took effect. The manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcohol became illegal across the United States. Speakeasies proliferated in cities from coast to coast, hidden behind false walls and guarded by passwords. Atlantic City did not bother hiding. The man responsible was Enoch Lewis Johnson, known to everyone as Nucky. He was not the mayor. He was the county treasurer, an office he held for 30 years. But titles meant nothing in Atlantic City. Power meant everything. and Nucky Johnson held absolute power. He collected tribute from every illegal operation in the city. He controlled the police, the courts, the political machine. He decided who prospered and who disappeared. His word was law, and his law was simple. Anything goes, as long as Nucky gets his cut. Under his reign, Atlantic City became what newspapers called the world's playground. Liquor flowed openly on the boardwalk. Prostitution operated from designated houses with police protection. Gambling halls ran around the clock. The city mocked the Volstead Act with such brazenness that federal agents largely stopped trying to enforce it there. Nucky stated his philosophy plainly. "We have whiskey, wine, women, song, and slot machines," he said. "I will not deny it, and I will not apologize for it. If the majority of people did not want them, they would not be profitable, and they would not exist." He was not wrong. The tourists came in numbers that dwarfed anything the previous generation had seen. They came precisely because Atlantic City offered what their hometowns forbade. The hypocrisy of prohibition, the gap between American law and American desire, created a market, and Nucky Johnson cornered it. The profits were astronomical. Nucky lived in a suite at the Ritz-Carlton. He wore a fresh carnation in his lapel every day. He controlled a political organization so complete that candidates he opposed simply did not appear on ballots. He was, by any measure, a gangster. But he was also the man who kept the lights on. In May of 1929, Nucky hosted a meeting that would cement Atlantic City's place in the mythology of American crime. At the President Hotel, on the boardwalk, the most powerful organized crime figures in the nation gathered to divide territory and prevent the bloodshed of competition. Al Capone was there, fresh from the St. Valentine's Day massacre in Chicago. Lucky Luciano attended, representing New York. Meyer Lansky, Dutch Schultz, Frank Costello. The men who would define American organized crime for the next half-century sat in Atlantic City and carved up the country like a Sunday roast. The conference established the framework for what would become known as the National Crime Syndicate. It proved that gangsters could cooperate. It also proved that Atlantic City was neutral ground, a place where the rules of the outside world did not apply. Nucky Johnson survived until 1941, when federal prosecutors finally nailed him for tax evasion. He served 4 years in Lewisburg Penitentiary, returned to Atlantic City, and lived quietly until his death in 1968. By then, the city he had built was dying. But, in 1930, standing on the boardwalk as the Claridge rose against the sky, no one could imagine decline. The city had conquered the sand, survived the hurricanes, defied prohibition, and hosted the most powerful criminals in America. The future seemed limitless. That same year, across the country, an unemployed salesman named Charles Darrow was shown a homemade game by friends in Atlantic City. Players bought and sold properties. They collected rent. They drove opponents into bankruptcy. Darrow refined the game, added the iconic design, and sold it to Parker Brothers in 1935. He called it Monopoly. The properties bore the names of Atlantic City's streets. Mediterranean Avenue, the cheapest, sat in the slums behind the boardwalk. Boardwalk itself became the most valuable space on the board, worth $400. The game became the best-selling board game in history. Atlantic City's street names entered the vocabulary of every American child. The city's mythology was codified, mass-produced, distributed into millions of homes where families gathered to simulate the accumulation of wealth through real estate and luck. It was the perfect memorial. Because by the time Monopoly dominated American game nights, the real Atlantic City had already begun to die. The lesson of Monopoly is simple. Eventually, one player owns everything, and everyone else goes bankrupt. Atlantic City was about to learn that lesson for real. The death of Atlantic City did not announce itself. It crept in like the tide, so gradual that the people standing on the beach did not notice the water rising until it reached their knees. The forces that would destroy the world's playground were already in motion before the Second World War ended. They gathered strength through the 1950s, became undeniable in the 60s, and by the 70s had reduced one of America's most famous resort cities to a national punchline. Understanding how this happened requires understanding what Atlantic City actually was. It was never a city in the traditional sense. It had no industry beyond pleasure, no manufacturing base, no corporate headquarters, no university anchoring intellectual life. It existed for one purpose: to separate tourists from their money in exchange for entertainment. When that exchange became available elsewhere, Atlantic City had nothing to fall back on. The first blow came from the sky. Commercial aviation transformed American geography after the war. Destinations that had once required days of travel suddenly lay hours away. The wealthy families who had made Atlantic City fashionable discovered they could reach Miami in the time it once took to reach the New Jersey shore. They could fly to Havana, to Nassau, to anywhere the sun shone and the drinks flowed. Why endure the crowds and the boarding house food of Atlantic City when Caribbean luxury awaited? The middle class followed. As air travel became affordable in the 50s and 60s, the aspirational tourist, the factory foreman saving for a special vacation, the school teacher splurging on a getaway, looked past the familiar shore toward exotic horizons. The second blow came from the machine that was supposed to make life better. Air conditioning conquered the American South. Cities that had emptied every summer as residents fled the unbearable heat suddenly became habitable year-round. Houston, Phoenix, Atlanta, Miami. The Sun Belt bloomed with shopping centers and office parks and subdivisions, all of them climate-controlled, all of them siphoning population and investment from the old industrial Northeast. More importantly, air conditioning made southern resort destinations viable for the summer months when they had previously been insufferable. Myrtle Beach, Gulf Shores, Panama City. These places offered the same sand and surf as Atlantic City, often at lower prices, without the decay that had begun creeping along the boardwalk. The third blow came from the highways. The interstate highway system, launched in 1956, paved America's wanderlust into concrete ribbons reaching everywhere. Families who had once been captive to railroad schedules now controlled their own itineraries. They could stop where they pleased, stay as long as they liked, bypass cities that failed to appeal. The highways spawned competitors Atlantic City had never faced: Ocean City, Maryland, Rehoboth Beach, Delaware. The Jersey Shore itself fractured into dozens of beach towns, each skimming tourists who might once have continued north to the boardwalk. Why fight the crowds in Atlantic City when Long Beach Island offered the same ocean with fewer people? The fourth blow came through the living room window. Television delivered entertainment into American homes with an intimacy and convenience no boardwalk could match. The vaudeville acts that had packed Steel Pier seemed quaint when Ed Sullivan brought Broadway into the den every Sunday night. The diving horses competed with Bonanza and I Love Lucy and Walter Cronkite reporting from Vietnam. Why travel 60 miles to see a show when the show came to you? These forces, aviation, air conditioning, automobiles, television, did not single out Atlantic City for destruction. They reshaped American leisure entirely. But Atlantic City was uniquely vulnerable because it had nothing else. It was a one-trick pony, and the trick had gotten old. The physical collapse followed the economic collapse, as it always does. By the late 1950s, the grand hotels along the boardwalk had begun their transformation into something no one wanted to name. The Traymore, once the largest hotel in the world, struggled to fill rooms. The Marlborough Blenheim, that architectural wedding cake of Moorish domes and oceanfront terraces, saw its clientele age and dwindle. Management deferred maintenance, paint peeled, carpets wore thin. The smell of mildew crept through hallways that had once sparkled with champagne and possibility. Some hotels simply closed. Others converted to a new purpose that announced the city's decline more clearly than any statistic. They became nursing homes. The grand seaside palaces, built to house the vital and the young, now warehoused the elderly and the dying. The same buildings, the same views, an entirely different meaning. The neighborhoods behind the boardwalk collapsed faster. Atlantic City had always been segregated. The grand hotels employed black workers as bellhops, waiters, and rolling chair pushers, but those workers were not permitted to live near the shore. They resided in the North Side, a community of wooden houses and small businesses that had developed its own culture, its own economy, its own pride. As the tourism economy contracted, the North Side contracted with it. Businesses closed, families left. Those who remained watched their property values collapse. The city, desperate for any solution, began condemning buildings and clearing land, promising redevelopment that never came. Parking lots replaced neighborhoods. Empty lots replaced parking lots. A community dissolved into asphalt and weeds. White flight accelerated through the 60s. The racial composition of the city inverted within a generation. What had been a predominantly white resort became a predominantly black and brown community, but without the economic base to support itself. The tourists still came, in diminishing numbers, but they no longer came from the demographic that lived there. They came, gambled, left. The money touched the city without nourishing it. By the mid-60s, the poverty rate had crossed 40%. It would never fall below 35% again. Not during the casino boom. Not during the supposed revival. Not ever. In August of 1964, the Democratic Party gathered in Atlantic City to nominate Lyndon Baines Johnson for president. It was supposed to be a coronation, a celebration of a party, united behind its leader. Instead, it became an autopsy. Reporters from across the nation descended on the boardwalk and could not believe what they found. The city they had read about, the glamorous resort of songs and movies and monopoly boards, had become a ruin. Hotels that had once hosted presidents now sagged with neglect. Streets that had once glittered now festered with abandoned storefronts and drifting garbage. One reporter compared Atlantic City to bombed-out Dresden. The comparison circulated widely. It was not considered unfair. The convention itself was marred by controversy over the seating of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, a dispute that fractured the Democratic coalition for a generation. But the lasting image from that August was simpler and sadder. The world's playground had become a slum with a view. The city scrambled for solutions. Civic leaders proposed an aquarium, a convention center, anything to attract visitors. Someone suggested converting a city dump into a ski slope. The ideas grew increasingly desperate because the underlying problem had no solution. Atlantic City had been built for a world that no longer existed. Then someone mentioned Las Vegas. Las Vegas had proven that gambling could transform a desert into a destination. The casinos there generated billions in revenue, supported tens of thousands of jobs, and attracted tourists who would never have visited Nevada for its natural beauty or cultural attractions. The money flowed because the games were rigged in the house's favor, which meant the house always won, which meant the house always had money to spend. The logic seemed irresistible. If gambling could save a patch of sand in the Mojave, why not a patch of sand on the Atlantic? New Jersey's state constitution prohibited gambling. So did the state's culture. This was not Nevada, where frontier libertarianism had always tolerated vice. This was the Mid-Atlantic, where mainline Protestant propriety still shaped political discourse. Gambling meant crime. Gambling meant corruption. Gambling meant the kind of people respectable communities did not want. But Atlantic City was no longer a respectable community. It was a dying one. And dying communities will accept bargains they would never consider in health. In 1974, supporters placed a referendum on the statewide ballot to legalize casino gambling. The opposition was immediate and overwhelming. The state attorney general revealed that organized crime figures were already purchasing Atlantic City real estate in anticipation of legalization. The mob was not speculating. It was investing. It knew what gambling would bring, because it had run illegal gambling operations for decades. The voters, presented with evidence that casinos would mean organized crime infiltration, rejected the referendum by a margin of 60 to 40. The defeat should have ended the conversation. It did not. The casino proponents regrouped with a strategy of breathtaking cynicism. They could not change what casinos were. They could only change how casinos were sold. First, they contained the geography. The 1974 referendum had proposed legalizing gambling statewide. The 1976 version limited casinos to Atlantic City only. Suburban voters who had recoiled at the thought of slot machines in their towns could now support gambling as someone else's problem. The vice would be quarantined on a barrier island already ruined by vice. What was there to lose? Second, they weaponized compassion. The new referendum dedicated casino tax revenue to programs for senior citizens. 8% of gaming revenue would fund the elderly across the state. Suddenly, gambling became charity. Ministers who had opposed the 1974 measure now endorsed legalization as a moral duty. Nuns appeared in campaign advertisements. The message was explicit: support gambling to help grandma. Third, they reframed the narrative. Atlantic City was no longer a cautionary tale of urban decay. It was a victim waiting to be rescued. The campaign slogans made the appeal personal: help yourself, help Atlantic City. The city's suffering became a tool for its exploitation. On November 2, 1976, New Jersey voters approved casino gambling by a margin of 1,535,000 to 1,180,000. The promise was codified into the state constitution. Casino revenue would fund senior programs and community development. Atlantic City would rise again. The resurrection had been authorized. What happened next proved that the devil does not always hide in the details. Sometimes he waves from the fine print. On May 26, 1978, Resorts International opened the first legal casino on the eastern seaboard outside Nevada. The line to enter stretched for blocks. Gamblers waited hours for the privilege of losing money. The pent-up demand stunned even the optimists. In its first year, Resorts International generated more revenue than any casino in Las Vegas. The Atlantic City miracle appeared real. Investors scrambled to join the gold rush. By 1988, 12 casinos operated along the boardwalk and marina. Annual visitors had exploded from 700,000 in 1978 to more than 33 million a decade later. The tax base swelled from $316 million before legalization to nearly $7 billion by the turn of the century. The tycoons arrived smelling opportunity and weakness in equal measure. Donald Trump entered Atlantic City in 1984. He was already famous, already branded, already convinced of his own genius. New York real estate had made him wealthy. Atlantic City would make him legendary. Or so he believed. His first casino, Trump Plaza, opened in 1984 through a partnership with Harrah's Entertainment. Trump contributed no money to the project. He contributed his name. His partners contributed everything else. When the casino succeeded, Trump took the credit. This would become a pattern. Trump Castle, later renamed Trump Marina, opened in 1985. 2 casinos, 2 chances to dominate the market. But Trump wanted more than dominance. He wanted supremacy. He wanted a monument. In 1988, he found one under construction. The Taj Mahal was supposed to be the grandest casino ever built. Resorts International had begun construction before its founder died unexpectedly, leaving the project unfinished and the company rudderless. Trump acquired the property for $273 million. He promised regulators he would complete it with conventional financing. Reasonable loans at reasonable rates. He lied. Instead of conventional financing, Trump raised $675 million through junk bonds paying 14% interest. The rate was nearly double what he had projected to the Casino Control Commission. The debt load was more than any casino could realistically service. The numbers did not work on paper, but Trump did not operate on paper. He operated on spectacle. The Taj Mahal opened on April 2, 1990, with a celebration designed to obliterate all memory of what had come before. Michael Jackson cut the ribbon. $14 million in Austrian crystal chandeliers glittered above 120,000 square feet of gaming floor. 1,250 hotel rooms awaited guests. 3,000 slot machines waited for coins. Trump told Larry King that night they had broken every record. Numbers nobody had ever seen before. He was right. The Taj Mahal broke records. Then reality broke the Taj Mahal. Marvin Roffman was a securities analyst who covered the casino industry. Before the opening, he told the Wall Street Journal what the numbers actually showed. When this property opens, he said, it will break every record in April, June, and July. But once the cold winds blow from October to February, it will not make it. The market is not there. Trump demanded Roffman be fired. His employer complied. It did not change the math. Within 16 days of opening, the Taj Mahal's bank account went negative 4 times. The deficits reached $1.7 million. State regulators began monitoring the casino's bank balances daily. By October, the Taj Mahal missed its first debt payment. In December of 1990, Trump's father sent a lawyer to the casino to purchase $3.3 million in chips. It was not a gambling trip. It was an illegal loan designed to inject cash into a dying operation. State regulators eventually fined the casino $65,000 for the violation. The fine was nothing. The desperation it revealed was everything. In July of 1991, the Taj Mahal filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. It had been open 15 months. The broader Trump empire teetered on annihilation. His organization carried $3.4 billion in debt. His personal guarantees totaled $832 million. State regulators warned that complete financial collapse of the Trump organization was not out of the question. Trump survived by surrendering. He gave up his yacht, his airline, his stake in the Plaza Hotel. He accepted allowances from his creditors. The man who had branded himself a winner became a debtor, negotiating terms of surrender. But the casinos kept his name on them. The name was all that mattered. The name kept the tourists coming. The name generated the revenue that serviced enough debt to keep the lights on. The Taj Mahal did not fail because gambling failed. It failed because it was designed to extract, not invest. It was a monument to one man's ego, financed by other people's money, built on the backs of contractors who would never be paid in full. Atlantic City took note. Then Atlantic City learned nothing. The casinos made billions. Atlantic City stayed poor. The paradox requires explanation. Walk through any Atlantic City casino in its prime, and you understood immediately why the city saw nothing. The buildings were designed as fortresses. No windows on the gaming floors, no clocks on the walls, no reason to leave, no reminder that an outside world existed. Restaurants inside, entertainment inside, shopping inside. Everything the tourist might want, provided within walls that captured every dollar before it could escape. The architecture was deliberate. Casino designers studied crowd psychology. They understood that gamblers who stepped outside might not return. They understood that a $20 bill spent at a boardwalk restaurant was a $20 bill that would never reach a slot machine. The buildings were constructed to prevent leakage. A 1993 investigation found that the casinos had created a closed economy. By putting restaurants and entertainment in their windowless gambling areas, they kept tourists from moving through the city and spreading money around. The visitors parked in casino garages, gambled in casino floors, ate in casino restaurants, watched casino shows, and left through casino exits. Atlantic City existed outside the tinted glass, but it might as well have been on another planet. The business model was extraction. The goal was draining dollars as quickly as possible from the pockets of people who, for the most part, could least afford to lose them. Luxury high rollers existed, but the real money came from bus tourists and day trippers, retirees spending social security checks, and working-class families hoping for a lucky break. The casinos cannibalized the local economy instead of supplementing it. Hundreds of independent restaurants closed. Bars that had survived Prohibition and the Depression could not survive competition with casino-subsidized buffets. Atlantic Avenue, the Main, commercial strip behind the boardwalk, gutted itself storefront by storefront until nothing remained but pawn shops and payday lenders. The neighborhoods fared worse. The North Side, that historically black community that had endured segregation and decline, now watched casinos rise while their remaining businesses were bulldozed for parking lots. Urban renewal, they called it. It looked like urban removal. One longtime resident testified to what had been lost. "We used to have a lot of African-American businesses in the North Side," he said. "Now the only African-American businesses they have are churches and barber shops. We own nothing." The constitutional promise of community development went unfulfilled. The Casino Reinvestment Development Authority collected hundreds of millions of dollars over the decades. Little of it reached the neighborhoods that needed it. The money disappeared into consultants and studies and projects that never materialized. The poverty rate held steady at 35%. The high school graduation rate languished below state averages. The unemployment rate remained stubbornly elevated. The senior citizens of New Jersey received their promised funding. The casinos delivered hundreds of millions to the state. But Atlantic City, the city that generated the wealth, remained poor. The money flowed through but never stayed. This was not failure. This was design. The monopoly ended the way all monopolies end, slowly, then suddenly. For 2 decades, Atlantic City enjoyed geographic protection. East Coast gamblers had nowhere else to go. The nearest legal casino was 1,000 miles away in Nevada. Atlantic City could deliver mediocre service at premium prices because it faced no competition. Then the competition arrived. Foxwoods Casino opened in Connecticut in 1992. Mohegan Sun followed in 1996. Suddenly, New England gamblers had alternatives closer than Atlantic City. The money that had flowed south began flowing elsewhere. Pennsylvania legalized slots in 2004 and table games in 2010. Casinos opened in Philadelphia, just 60 miles from Atlantic City, offering the same games to the same customers without the tolls and traffic of the Atlantic City Expressway. Delaware expanded its gambling. Maryland approved casinos. New York opened gaming facilities. Atlantic City found itself surrounded by competitors offering the same product with greater convenience. The geographic moat had been drained. Peak revenue arrived in 2006. $5.2 billion. It would never be reached again. The Great Recession accelerated the decline. Discretionary spending collapsed nationwide. The working-class tourists who had filled the buses and fed the slots suddenly had no money to lose. They stayed home. They gambled online. They visited the new casinos that had opened closer to where they lived. By 2014, the industry that was supposed to save, Atlantic City began destroying itself. 4 casinos closed in a single year. 1/3 of Atlantic City's gambling halls vanished between January and September of 2014. The Atlantic Club went first, closing January 13th after years of losses. 1,650 workers received their final paychecks and joined the unemployment line. The Showboat followed on August 31st, a closure that defied even casino logic. The Showboat was profitable. It made money, but it was owned by Caesars Entertainment, which also owned 2 other Atlantic City casinos. Caesars calculated that closing the Showboat would force its customers to gamble at Caesars properties instead. Corporate survival trumped city survival. 2,000 more jobs vanished. Revel died on September 2nd, and its death was the most spectacular of all. Revel had opened just 27 months earlier, a $2.4 billion bet that Atlantic City could reinvent itself as a luxury destination. The building soared 47 stories, the tallest in the city, a glass tower marketed as a seaside pleasure palace where gaming was almost an afterthought. The concept was fatally flawed from inception. Revel banned smoking, alienating the cigarette-dependent gamblers who formed Atlantic City's core customer base. It offered no buffet, dismissing the bus tourists who expected cheap food as part of the casino experience. It had no Players Club loyalty program, ignoring the regulars who expected rewards for their losses. Room prices started high and stayed high. Management radiated contempt for the very customers it needed to survive. Revel filed for bankruptcy once, reorganized, then filed again. In the end, the building sold at auction for $90 million. The original investors lost more than $2 billion. The building had cost roughly $82,000 per square foot to construct. It sold for roughly $3.60. Trump Plaza, closed on September 16th, the final casino to fall that year. 1,100 more workers walked out the door. The building sat empty, its sign reading only U Plaza, because the T, R, M, and P had burned out and no one bothered replacing them. In a single year, 8,000 people lost their jobs in a city of 40,000. The unemployment rate spiked to 14%, double the state average. The foreclosure rate became the highest in the nation. Property values collapsed by nearly half. The city approached bankruptcy. The Miss America pageant had just arrived in town for its annual celebration. Beauty queens and bread lines shared the same crumbling boardwalk. The Trump Taj Mahal limped on, surviving through another bankruptcy, kept alive by an injection from billionaire Carl Icahn. It finally closed on October 10, 2016. 3,000 more jobs. 26 years after Michael Jackson cut the ribbon, the eighth wonder of the world went dark. The house had won. Atlantic City had lost. And the house, it turned out, had never been Atlantic City at all. The unemployment office opened at 8 in the morning. By 6, the line stretched around the block. They came in casino uniforms because they had not yet had time to change. Dealers in black vests. Cocktail waitresses in sequined tops, designed to catch the light of slot machines that would never spin for them again. Security guards. Housekeepers. Cooks who had spent 20 years perfecting the timing of a comp buffet, now standing in a government building filling out forms that asked for previous employment history as if anyone did not already know. The Atlantic City Convention Center processed unemployment claims that autumn of 2014, while in the same building, Miss America contestants rehearsed their evening gown walks. The juxtaposition required no commentary. Beauty queens and bread lines. The boardwalk had seen stranger things, but never anything so perfectly symbolic. 8,000 jobs had vanished in 9 months. In a city of 40,000, this was not a recession. It was an amputation. The Bureau of Labor Statistics confirmed what everyone already knew. Atlantic City had lost more jobs than any metropolitan area in the nation that year. Not per capita, in absolute terms. A barrier island 5 miles long had shed more employment than cities 10 times its size. The workers scattered because they had no choice. Some found positions at the surviving casinos, accepting pay cuts and reduced hours for the privilege of remaining employed. Some commuted to Philadelphia or the casinos that had opened in Pennsylvania, trading 90 minutes each way for a paycheck. Some left New Jersey entirely, following the jobs to wherever jobs existed. Those who stayed watched their city hollow out. The foreclosure notices arrived in waves. Families who had built lives around casino employment discovered that mortgage payments do not pause for economic catastrophe. The banks took the houses. The houses sat empty. The empty houses dragged down the value of occupied houses. The occupied houses became underwater. The cycle fed itself. Property values across Atlantic City collapsed from $20 billion in 2010 to $11 billion by 2014. Nearly half the assessed value of every building, every lot, every square foot of this barrier island simply evaporated. Homeowners who had considered themselves middle class discovered they owed more than they owned. The city government approached bankruptcy because city governments depend on property taxes, and property taxes depend on property values. When values collapse, revenue collapses. When revenue collapses, services collapse. When services collapse, more residents leave. When residents leave, values collapse further. New Jersey eventually intervened with a state takeover, stripping Atlantic City of control over its own finances. The city that had been promised salvation through gambling, now required supervision like a child who could not be trusted with an allowance. The casinos that survived did not mourn the ones that died. They celebrated. The theory was simple. Fewer casinos meant less competition. The gamblers who had patronized the Showboat and the Atlantic Club and Revel and Trump Plaza would now patronize the survivors. Revenue would consolidate. The remaining properties would thrive. The theory proved partially correct. The 9 casinos that remained did absorb some of the orphaned gamblers. Profits stabilized. The bleeding slowed. But the fundamental problem remained unsolved. Atlantic City's monopoly was gone forever. Every year, more competition opened in more states. Online gambling grew from novelty to industry, allowing people to lose money from their living room sofas without ever approaching the Atlantic City Expressway. The customer base that had sustained 12 casinos could not sustain 9 at their previous scale. The survivors adapted by shrinking expectations. The glittering promises of the 1970s, that casinos would restore Atlantic City to its former glory, quietly disappeared from official discourse. Nobody spoke of Renaissance anymore. They spoke of stabilization, sustainability, managing decline. The city tried to diversify. Stockton University opened a satellite campus, bringing students to the boardwalk. The convention center expanded, chasing the corporate meeting business. The Walk, an outlet shopping mall, attempted to create a retail district where tourists might spend money outside casino walls. The Orange Loop initiative converted abandoned lots into restaurants and bars, trying to prove that Atlantic City could offer experiences beyond gambling. These efforts were not failures. They generated activity. They employed people. They brought modest tourism dollars that did not flow through slot machines. But the scale told the truth. Non-gaming tourism in Atlantic City approached $1 billion annually by the 2020s. The casinos at peak had generated $5.2 billion. The diversification everyone championed replaced perhaps 20% of what had been lost. Progress, yes. Salvation, no. 9 casinos operate in Atlantic City today. All of them turn profits. None of them are thriving. The 2024 numbers paint a portrait of managed mediocrity. Total gaming revenue reached $3.31 billion, respectable by any measure except comparison to the past. Profits fell 9.3% from the previous year. In-person gambling continues its long decline while online gaming grows. The casinos contribute record sums to state coffers. $572 million flowed to New Jersey's Casino Revenue Fund in 2024. Money distributed to senior programs across the state, exactly as the 1976 referendum promised. The constitutional bargain has been honored in the narrowest possible sense, but Atlantic City remains poor. The poverty rate holds steady above 35%, more than triple the national average. Median household income sits at $35,000 in a state where the average exceeds $90,000. The employment rate hovers around 50%. Meaning half the working-age population does not work. These statistics have not meaningfully improved since the casinos arrived. They did not improve during the boom years when 12 casinos operated and 33 million tourists visited annually. They did not improve when the money flowed freely. They have not improved now that the money flows less freely. The structural trap is inescapable. The casinos want lower taxes. They argue, correctly, that high taxes make them less competitive with casinos in neighboring states. They threaten relocation. They demand relief. The residents need services, schools, police, infrastructure. The basic functions of municipal government require funding. The property tax base has collapsed. The only remaining source of significant revenue is the casinos themselves. The state extracts gambling revenue for programs that benefit people who do not live in Atlantic City. The constitutional dedication to senior services means that billions have flowed out of the city over 5 decades, funding assistance in suburbs and rural areas while the place that generates the money remains impoverished. This is not a failure of the system. This is the system. Atlantic City was designed as an extraction point, not a community. The casinos extract money from gamblers. The state extracts money from casinos. The residents receive what remains, which is never enough. Walk 1 block from the boardwalk, and the glitter ends. The transition is not gradual. It is violent. The casino towers rise behind you, their windows reflecting the morning sun, their facades suggesting wealth and possibility. Before you, Atlantic Avenue stretches toward the mainland, and Atlantic Avenue has been gutted. Cash for gold shops with barred windows. Check cashing storefronts that charge fees the middle class would never tolerate. Liquor stores with bulletproof glass separating clerk from customer. Empty lots where buildings once stood, now colonized by weeds and broken bottles and the occasional tent. The poverty is not hidden. It cannot be hidden. It confronts every tourist willing to walk 10 minutes from the slot machines. The North Side, that historically black community that predates the casinos by generations, has been transformed into something its founders would not recognize. The small businesses are gone. The family homes have been replaced by public housing projects that concentrate poverty rather than alleviating it. One long-time resident described the pattern with precision. They would bunch people all together in the projects, and a lot of those got torn down. Now they are rebuilding them so they are new, but it is still the same concept. The same concept. Containment dressed as assistance. Isolation marketed as development. The poor kept visible enough to justify continued intervention, but never prosperous enough to threaten the narrative that Atlantic City needs saving. Beneath the boardwalk, in the shadows where the wooden planks block the sun, people sleep. They have always slept there. The homeless of Atlantic City are not newcomers created by the casino closures, though the closures certainly added to their numbers. They are a permanent feature of a city that generates billions in gambling revenue and cannot house its own residents. The tourists walk above them, footsteps echoing on the planks, heading toward casinos that will take their money before sending them home. The distance between the walker and the sleeper is 8 feet of vertical space. It might as well be 8,000 miles. The skyline tells the story for anyone willing to read it. Trump Plaza stood empty for years after its 2014 closure, the tallest abandoned building on the boardwalk, its sign missing letters, its windows dark, its parking garage crumbling. In February of 2021, the city finally imploded it. The demolition took 30 seconds. The lot remains vacant. The former Revel, that $2.4 billion monument to hubris, has cycled through owners and names. It operates now as Ocean Casino Resort, struggling to find a market position that its original designers never imagined. The building remains beautiful. The business case remains elusive. The showboat has reopened and reopened again, its fate perpetually uncertain. A profitable casino killed by corporate strategy, now searching for a reason to exist. The other closures left smaller wounds. The Atlantic Club was demolished. The smaller failed casinos disappeared into the landscape of abandonment that characterizes so much of Atlantic City. Buildings that once employed thousands now employ demolition crews or nothing at all. What remains is enough to sustain an industry, but not enough to sustain a city. The 9 surviving casinos employ perhaps 25,000 people, down from 40,000 at the peak. They generate billions in revenue that flows mostly outward. They maintain the boardwalk and the beach access and the minimum infrastructure required to keep tourists coming. But they have never rebuilt the neighborhoods. They have never funded the schools. They have never created the middle-class prosperity that the 1976 campaign promised. They have done exactly what they were designed to do: extract value from visitors and concentrate it in corporate balance sheets. Atlantic City is not a failed casino town. It is a successful extraction operation. The ocean is rising. This is not metaphor. Sea levels along the New Jersey coast have increased measurably over the past century and continue to climb. Storm surges that once occurred rarely now occur regularly. Flooding that once surprised now merely inconveniences. 87% of Atlantic City's residents live in a 100-year floodplain. This statistic does not mean they will flood once per century. It means that in any given year, there is a 1% chance of catastrophic flooding. Over a 30-year mortgage, the odds become significant. Over a lifetime, they become probable. The barrier island that was never meant to support a city will eventually remind everyone of that fact. The question is not whether, but when. The engineers can build seawalls. The planners can elevate structures. The insurance companies can adjust premiums. None of this changes the underlying reality that Atlantic City exists in defiance of geography. Jonathan Pitney looked at a sandbar in 1854 and saw a health resort. His successors looked at the same sandbar and saw a casino mecca. Both visions required ignoring what the land itself was saying. Both visions imposed human ambition on a landscape that did not consent. The ocean does not negotiate. It rises. It erodes. It waits. Monopoly remains the best-selling board game in history. Children still learn Atlantic City's street names before they learn their own state capitals. Mediterranean Avenue still represents poverty. Boardwalk still represents wealth. The distance between them still represents the American dream. But the real lesson of Monopoly is not aspiration, it is inevitability. Play the game long enough, and one player accumulates everything. Hotels rise on Boardwalk and Park Place. Rents become unpayable. Opponents mortgage their properties, then lose their properties, then lose entirely. The game ends when one player owns the board and everyone else has been bankrupted. This is not a flaw in the game. It is the point of the game. Monopoly was originally designed to illustrate the dangers of wealth concentration. Its creator, Elizabeth Magie, called it the landlord's game and intended it as a critique of capitalist property relations. The Parker brothers sanitized the politics but kept the mechanics. The ruthlessness remained. Atlantic City learned the lesson. The casinos won. The city lost. The house took its cut. The game ended exactly as the rules predicted. Stand on the boardwalk at dawn and you can almost see what Pitney saw. The ocean stretches to the horizon, endless and indifferent. The beach runs north and south, the same sand that defeated the first tourists, the sand that required the boardwalk to tame it. The salt air still carries the faint medicine Pitney prescribed, still offers whatever healing the sea has always offered. The casinos rise behind you, their windows catching the first light. They are beautiful in their way, these monuments to appetite, these temples of chance. They were built to extract, and they have extracted. They were built to profit, and they have profited. They fulfilled their purpose with perfect efficiency. The city they were supposed to save remains unsaved. 35% poverty rate, 50% employment rate, $35,000 median income. The numbers have not changed in decades. They are not changing now. They will not change tomorrow. The tourists will arrive in a few hours, following the same paths their grandparents followed, seeking the same escape their grandparents sought. They will park in casino garages and walk through climate-controlled corridors and sit before machines designed by psychologists to maximize engagement and minimize resistance. They will lose on average, because the house always wins on average. Then they will leave. The money will flow through Atlantic City without nourishing it, as the money has always flowed. The state will collect its share. The corporations will collect their share. The residents will collect what remains. A homeless man stirs beneath the boardwalk, waking to another day in the city that luck forgot. Above him, a tourist plays slots on her phone while walking toward a casino entrance, the little machine in her palm pinging with simulated wins. In the distance, a sign flickers. Your lucky day. In 1976, the people of New Jersey were promised that casinos would save Atlantic City. They were promised the money would trickle down. They were promised a rising tide would lift all boats. 50 years later, the tide is still rising. The casinos still generate billions. The state still collects hundreds of millions. The promise has been kept in every legal particular. Atlantic City remains poor. Atlantic City has always been poor. Atlantic City will be poor tomorrow. The boardwalk still stands, rebuilt after every hurricane, maintained by casino money and tourist traffic, and the stubborn refusal to admit defeat. The planks still echo with footsteps. The rolling chairs still carry tourists, though fewer now, pushed by workers who earn what workers have always earned in Atlantic City, which is not enough. The casinos still glow. They will glow tonight, and tomorrow night, and every night, until the economics no longer justify the electricity. They are machines for extracting hope and converting it to profit. They perform this function brilliantly. But the dream is dead. It died the moment everyone realized the truth that Jonathan Pitney could not have known. That the voters of 1976 refused to believe. That the tourists walking the boardwalk still cannot accept. Atlantic City was never the house. Atlantic City was always the mark. The sandbar, the sucker. The patsy with pockets full of ambition and nothing to show for it. The house always wins. Atlantic City was never the house. The ocean rises. The casinos glow. The poor remain poor. And somewhere in a suburban living room, a child rolls the dice, lands on boardwalk, and dreams of wealth that exists only on a cardboard square, in a game designed to teach a lesson that nobody wants to learn,